What early American pioneers ate to stay warm during deadly winter? The hunger that followed the snow. Winter on the American frontier was not simply a season. It was a test. When the first waves of pioneers pushed westward across North America during the 18th and 19th centuries, they entered landscapes that were both beautiful and brutally unforgiving. Endless forests, open prairies, and frozen rivers stretched farther than most of them had ever imagined. But with that beauty came a cold that seeped into bones, froze breath in the air, and threatened survival every single day. Many of the pioneers who settled the frontier came from places where winters were already harsh. Yet the winters they encountered in places like the Ohio Valley, the Great Plains, and the Rocky Mountain territories was something entirely different. Temperatures could drop far below freezing for weeks. Snowstorms could trap families in cabins for days or even months. Roads vanished under ice, and hunting animals became scarce. In those moments, survival depended on something incredibly simple: food. But not just any food. The pioneers quickly learned that what they ate could mean the difference between warmth and deadly cold, because the human body burns energy to create heat. And during brutal winters, the body needs far more fuel than usual. The early settlers might not have understood modern nutrition science, but they understood something through experience. Heavy, rich, and calorie-dense foods helped them survive. And so the frontier diet began to take shape. It was a diet built around fat, meat, corn, and anything that could provide lasting energy in freezing temperatures. One of the most important foods on the frontier was something surprisingly simple: corn. Corn had been cultivated by Native American tribes for centuries before European settlers arrived. It was hardy, adaptable, and could grow in many environments. Pioneers quickly adopted it as a staple crop because it could be stored for long periods and prepared in many ways. During winter, corn often became the backbone of daily meals. Families ground dried corn into cornmeal using hand mills. From that cornmeal, they made cornbread, johnny cakes, and mush. Corn mush was especially common during winter. It was thick, filling, and could be eaten hot, which helped warm the body. A typical winter morning might begin before sunrise. The cabin would still be cold from the night. Frost sometimes formed on the inside of the wooden walls. Someone would wake early to restart the fire in the hearth. Soon the sound of a pot being placed over the flames would fill the quiet cabin. Cornmeal and water would be stirred together slowly, thickening into a heavy porridge. Sometimes a little salt was added. If the family was fortunate, they might mix in milk or butter. But even plain corn mush provided something vital: energy. Hot food in winter was more than comfort. It was survival. Another food that played a crucial role was pork. On many frontier farms, pigs were easier to raise than cattle. They could eat almost anything and required less care. Because of this, pork became one of the most reliable sources of meat for pioneer families. In late autumn, many families performed what was known as the hog slaughter. This was one of the most important events of the year. As winter approached, farmers slaughtered several pigs and preserved the meat before freezing temperatures set in permanently. Every part of the animal was used. Nothing could be wasted on the frontier. Large cuts of pork were salted heavily and packed into barrels. This process created salt pork, which could last for months without spoiling. Salt pork became one of the most common winter foods. It was fatty, rich, and packed with calories. When pioneers cooked salt pork in a skillet, The fat melted into the pan, filling the cabin with a deep, savory smell. That fat was incredibly valuable. It could be used to fry bread, cook vegetables, or add flavor to stews. Fat was the secret weapon against winter cold. A lean diet would not keep the body warm in freezing temperatures, but fat burned slowly in the body, producing long-lasting energy and heat. That is why pioneer meals often looked heavy by modern standards. But during a frontier winter, heavy food was exactly what people needed. Beans were another essential winter staple. Dried beans could be stored for months and required no refrigeration. When cooked slowly over a fire, they turned soft and filling. Pioneer families often simmered beans in iron pots for hours, sometimes adding salt pork for flavor. The result was a thick, hearty stew. It was the kind of meal that could warm a person from the inside out. Many families ate beans almost every day during winter months. And while the meals might sound repetitive, pioneers developed many ways to make the same ingredients feel different. Sometimes beans were mashed. Sometimes they were cooked with onions or wild herbs. Sometimes they were poured over cornbread. Creativity was necessary and supplies were limited. Wild game also played an important role in winter diets. If a family had skilled hunters, the winter table might include venison, rabbit, squirrel, or wild turkey. Hunting in winter was difficult, but it could provide valuable fresh meat when stored food supplies began to run low. Venison was particularly prized. Deer meat was lean but flavorful. When cooked in stews with vegetables and fat, it created a meal that could sustain an entire family. Hunters often dried strips of venison to make jerky, which could be carried easily and eaten during long journeys. Jerky was light but packed with protein. Another common food was something called pemmican. This was a food originally developed by Native American tribes and later adopted by explorers and traders. Pemmican was made by mixing dried meat with melted fat and sometimes berries. The mixture was pressed into dense cakes. It could last for months without spoiling. Pemmican was incredibly high in calories, which made it perfect for surviving cold environments. Even small amounts provided significant energy. Frontier travelers and fur traders often relied on pemmican during winter journeys across frozen landscapes. For pioneer families, however, daily life during winter often revolved around the hearth. The hearth was the heart of the cabin. It provided heat, light, and a place to cook food. Iron pots hung over the fire from metal hooks. Cast iron skillets rested on hot coals. The smell of simmering food filled the small wooden spaces where families lived. Meals were rarely fancy, but they were deeply satisfying, because every bite meant warmth, every spoonful meant strength, and every meal meant the family had survived another freezing day. As winter storms howled outside and snow piled against the cabin walls, pioneer families gathered close to the fire. They ate slowly. They shared stories, and they hoped the food they had stored would last until spring. Because on the frontier, winter could feel endless, and hunger was never far away. The foods that fueled warmth in the coldest months. Winter on the frontier had a way of changing everything. During the warmer months, pioneer families could depend on gardens, fresh milk, and easier hunting. But when winter arrived, the world seemed to shrink. Snow covered the fields where crops once grew. Rivers froze over. The forests became quieter as animals hid or migrated. For many pioneer families, the food they had stored during autumn now became their lifeline. They understood something very important about winter survival. When temperatures dropped and work remained hard, the human body needed much more energy. Chopping firewood, hauling water, tending animals, and simply staying warm burned enormous amounts of calories. So the foods pioneers depended on in winter were not light meals. They were heavy, rich, and designed to keep a person going through long, freezing days. One of the most common foods eaten by early American pioneers during winter was something called hardtack. Hardtack was incredibly simple. It was made from flour, water, and sometimes a little salt. The dough was baked slowly until it became extremely hard and dry. In fact, it was often so hard that people joked it could break teeth. But its simplicity made it perfect for survival, because hardtack could last for months, sometimes even years, without spoiling. It could be stored in barrels and carried on long journeys. During winter, pioneers often softened hardtack by dipping it in soup or coffee. Sometimes it was broken into pieces and cooked in stews. While hardtack alone did not provide many nutrients, it filled the stomach and provided carbohydrates that the body could convert into energy. But pioneers rarely ate it alone. They usually paired it with something much richer. That something was often animal fat. Fat was incredibly valuable on the frontier. Today, many people try to avoid fatty foods, but pioneers saw fat as essential. It helped them survive. When pioneers cooked meat like pork or venison, the fat that melted in the pan was carefully saved. This fat, often called lard, was stored in containers and used for cooking almost everything. Cornbread fried in lard became crispy and filling. Vegetables cooked in lard gained flavor and calories. Even simple meals became far more satisfying when cooked with fat. Because fat contains more than twice the calories of carbohydrates or protein, it provided long-lasting energy during freezing weather. And in a time when people worked physically from sunrise to sunset, that energy was crucial. Another important winter food was salted beef. Although pork was more common, some families also preserved beef by salting it heavily. Large chunks of meat were packed with layers of salt in wooden barrels. Over time, the salt drew moisture out of the meat, preventing bacteria from growing. The result was a tough but durable food that could last all winter. Before cooking salted beef, pioneers usually soaked it in water to remove some of the salt. Then they boiled it slowly with vegetables like cabbage, potatoes, or onions. The boiling process softened the meat and created a rich broth. That broth itself became valuable food. Warm broth was comforting in cold weather, and it helped stretch small amounts of meat into meals that could feed an entire family. Vegetables also played a role in the winter diet, though fresh vegetables were rare. Instead, pioneers relied on vegetables that could survive long storage. Potatoes were one of the most important. Potatoes could be stored in root cellars beneath cabins or buried underground where the temperature stayed cool but above freezing. When kept properly, potatoes could last for many months. During winter, they were boiled, mashed, roasted in ashes, or added to soups. Potatoes provided carbohydrates, which the body quickly turned into energy. And because they were filling, they helped prevent hunger when meat supplies ran low. Another vegetable often stored for winter was cabbage. But pioneers rarely ate fresh cabbage for long. Instead, they turned it into sauerkraut. Sauerkraut was made by shredding cabbage and fermenting it with salt. The fermentation process preserved the cabbage for months and created a sour, tangy flavor. This simple food had an unexpected benefit. It helped prevent scurvy, a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency. During long winters without fresh fruits or vegetables, scurvy could become dangerous. But sauerkraut contained enough vitamin C to keep people healthy. Many pioneers might not have understood the science behind it, but they noticed that eating fermented foods helped prevent illness. So sauerkraut became a common winter food. Another surprisingly important source of winter nutrition came from maple sugar. In parts of North America where maple trees grew, pioneers learned the art of collecting maple sap from indigenous communities. During late winter and early spring, maple trees produced sap that could be boiled down into syrup or sugar. Maple sugar was easier to store than syrup. It could be used to sweeten foods, preserve fruits, or add flavor to simple meals. While sugar might seem like a luxury, it provided quick energy. During cold weather, even small amounts of sugar could help the body stay active. For families living deep in forested areas, maple sugar sometimes became the only sweetener available for months. But winter diets were not only about stored foods. Sometimes survival depended on the land itself. Even in winter, skilled pioneers knew how to find food in the wilderness. Trapping animals was one of the most reliable methods. Small animals like rabbits, muskrats, and squirrels remained active during winter. Trappers set simple snares or traps along animal paths. When successful, these traps provided fresh meat that could break the monotony of preserved foods. Fresh meat also improved nutrition, because preserved meats often lost some nutrients during the curing process. Another winter food source came from something many people today would never consider eating: tree bark. Certain inner barks, especially from pine trees, could be eaten in emergencies. Pioneers sometimes scraped the soft inner layer and boiled it into soups or dried it into flour. While it was not particularly tasty, it contained small amounts of nutrients and fiber that could help people survive during extreme food shortages. This type of food was rarely eaten unless conditions became desperate. But the frontier often pushed people into desperate situations. There were winters when supplies ran dangerously low. Blizzards blocked travel. Hunting failed. Stored food spoiled or ran out. During those moments, pioneers relied on every bit of knowledge they had learned from Native American tribes, trappers, and other settlers who had faced the wilderness before them. And slowly, over generations, a kind of frontier wisdom developed. People learned which foods kept the body warm the longest. They learned which meals gave strength for chopping wood or walking miles through snow. And they learned how to stretch a small amount of food into meals that could feed entire families. The result was a winter diet that might seem simple today: cornmeal, salt pork, beans, potatoes, game meat. But when prepared carefully and eaten together, these foods created something powerful. They gave the pioneers what they needed most: energy, warmth, and the strength to face another freezing morning on the American frontier. Outside the cabin, the wind could howl across frozen fields. Snow could pile against the door. But inside, near the fire, a pot of stew might still be simmering. And as long as there was food in that pot, there was hope that the family would make it through the winter. The heavy frontier meals that fought the cold. By the time the deep months of winter arrived on the American frontier, pioneer families had already settled into a rhythm of survival. Days were short, nights were long, and the cold seemed to press against the walls of their cabins with relentless force. For many settlers, winter was the season when food became the center of daily life. Not because there was abundance, but because every meal mattered more than ever. Food meant warmth, food meant strength. And sometimes, food meant the difference between life and death. The pioneers who survived the harshest winters were often the ones who understood how to prepare meals that could truly sustain the body. Light meals would never be enough in freezing temperatures. The body burned too many calories simply trying to stay warm. So frontier cooking developed around one simple idea: make food dense, make it filling, make it last. One of the most famous winter dishes on the frontier was something simply called pioneer stew. There was no single recipe for it. Instead, it was a flexible meal made from whatever ingredients a family had available. A large iron pot would be placed over the fire, sometimes hanging from a metal hook in the hearth. Into that pot went chunks of salted pork or beef, dried beans, potatoes, onions, and sometimes bits of cornmeal dumplings. Water was added, and the mixture was left to simmer slowly for hours. The smell of stew filling a cabin during winter was more than comforting. It was reassuring, because that pot meant there was still food. And as long as the pot kept boiling, people could eat. These stews were incredibly practical. The long cooking time softened tough cuts of meat and dried beans. It also blended flavors together in a way that made simple ingredients taste rich and satisfying. Sometimes families even kept the same pot going for several days. Leftovers from one meal were simply added back into the pot with more water and fresh ingredients. This practice created something similar to what later generations would call a perpetual stew. It was an efficient way to stretch food supplies. Another winter favorite was dumplings. Dumplings were made from simple dough, using flour or cornmeal, mixed with water or milk. The dough was rolled into small pieces and dropped into boiling soup or broth. Within minutes, the dumplings expanded and became soft, thick pieces of bread floating in the stew. They soaked up the flavor of the broth and made the meal far more filling. Dumplings were especially useful when meat was scarce. Even with very little meat in the pot, dumplings could turn a thin soup into a heavy meal that satisfied hunger. And hunger was a constant concern during winter. Another food that played a big role in winter survival was pancakes. Today, pancakes might seem like a breakfast treat, but for pioneers, they were serious fuel. Frontier pancakes were thicker and heavier than modern versions. They were usually made from cornmeal or coarse flour and fried in a skillet with lard. Because they were fried in fat, they provided a powerful combination of carbohydrates and calories. Sometimes pioneers added molasses or maple sugar to the batter if they had it. Other times they simply ate the pancakes plain, perhaps dipping them in leftover meat grease. It might not sound appealing today, but in the cold winters of the frontier, it was exactly the kind of energy people needed. Bread also remained a central part of the winter diet. But baking bread on the frontier was not easy. Many pioneer cabins did not have proper ovens. Instead, bread was often baked in a heavy cast iron pot known as a Dutch oven. The pot was placed directly in the fire, and hot coals were piled on top of the lid. Inside, the dough slowly baked into thick, dense loaves. This bread was heavier than modern bread, but extremely filling. When eaten with butter, lard, or meat, it provided long-lasting energy. Another fascinating winter food came from the forests themselves: acorns. Indigenous peoples had used acorns as food for centuries, and some pioneers learned the same techniques. Acorns from oak trees contain nutrients and fat, but they also contain bitter tannins. To make them edible, the acorns had to be soaked or boiled repeatedly to remove the bitterness. Once prepared, the acorns could be ground into flour. This flour could then be used to make bread, porridge, or thick soups. While acorns were not a daily food for most pioneers, they became incredibly valuable during difficult winters, when normal food supplies were low. Another important winter habit involved drinking warm beverages. Hot drinks helped warm the body and provided small amounts of energy. Coffee became extremely popular among pioneers during the 19th century. Even in remote areas, settlers often traded for coffee beans and roasted them at home. A hot cup of coffee early in the morning became part of the frontier routine. But when coffee ran out, pioneers sometimes improvised. They made substitutes from roasted corn, chicory roots, or even burnt bread. These substitutes did not taste exactly like coffee, but they created a warm, dark drink that helped people start the day. Tea was also common among some settlers, especially those who had come from European traditions. But regardless of the drink, the warmth itself mattered. A hot drink could warm cold hands and lift tired spirits during long winter mornings. Perhaps one of the most interesting winter foods eaten by pioneers was suet. Suet is the hard fat found around the kidneys of animals like cattle and sheep. Today, it is mostly used in cooking or bird feed. But on the frontier, it was considered valuable food. Suet could be melted and mixed with flour, dried fruit, or grains to create heavy puddings or cakes. These foods were incredibly rich. A small portion could provide a large amount of energy, and during extreme cold, that energy helped the body generate heat. Children especially benefited from these rich foods because they needed calories to grow while also enduring the freezing conditions. But even with all these foods, winter could still become dangerous. Some winters lasted longer than expected. Snowstorms destroyed stored food. Crops from the previous year failed. Under those conditions, pioneer diets sometimes became extremely limited. Families might survive on little more than cornmeal and salt pork for weeks. Meals became smaller. Hunger grew, yet people still found ways to endure. They shared food with neighbors. They hunted whenever possible. They stretched every ingredient as far as it could go. And slowly, day by day, they waited for spring, because spring meant new plants, new animals, and new hope. But until that moment arrived, the pioneers relied on the foods that could fight the cold from the inside. Heavy stews, fatty meats, thick breads, simple ingredients transformed by patience and necessity. These were the meals that helped ordinary people survive some of the harshest winters in early American history. And around countless small fires burning inside the wooden cabins, those meals kept the frontier alive, the hidden survival foods of the frozen frontier. By the middle of winter, the frontier often felt like a world locked in ice. Snow covered the ground in thick layers. Trees stood silent under heavy frost. Rivers that once carried boats and trade froze solid enough to walk across. For the pioneers, living in small wooden cabins scattered across the wilderness, the outside world became distant and dangerous. Travel slowed. Supplies became precious. And the food stored during autumn had to last. The pioneers who survived these months were not always the strongest or the bravest. Often, they were the ones who had learned the most about food. What to save, what to cook, and what hidden resources the land could still provide even in the coldest weather. One of the most important lessons pioneers learned came from the Native American tribes who had lived on the land for generations. Long before European settlers arrived, indigenous communities had developed sophisticated ways to survive winter. Their knowledge of plants, animals, and preservation techniques became incredibly valuable to the newcomers struggling to adapt. One such food was pemmican, which had already proven its value for hunters and explorers. Pemmican was made by drying lean meat, often bison or deer, until it became brittle. The dried meat was then pounded into small flakes or powder. After that, melted fat was mixed into the meat, along with dried berries. Once the mixture cooled, it formed dense cakes of food. These cakes were small but incredibly powerful sources of energy. Because they combined protein and fat in a compact form, pemmican could provide long-lasting fuel for the body. A single handful could keep a person going for hours in freezing temperatures. For travelers, fur traders, and explorers crossing the wilderness during winter, pemmican was sometimes the only food they carried. But pioneer families also relied on another food that helped them endure the cold: molasses. Molasses was a thick, dark syrup produced during the refining of sugar. It was not always easy to obtain on the frontier, but when families had access to it, they used it carefully. Molasses was rich in minerals and sugar, which meant it provided quick energy. During the exhausting work of winter, that energy could make a real difference. Pioneers often mixed molasses into baked goods such as bread or cakes. They also stirred it into hot drinks or poured small amounts over cornbread. It added sweetness to otherwise simple meals. But more importantly, it gave tired bodies a burst of energy during long, cold days. Another fascinating survival food came from something pioneers often overlooked during warmer seasons: nuts. Walnuts, hickory nuts, chestnuts, and other wild nuts could be collected during autumn and stored for winter. These nuts were incredibly valuable because they were packed with fat and calories. Unlike many other foods, nuts did not spoil quickly if kept dry. A handful of walnuts or chestnuts could provide a surprising amount of warmth and strength. Chestnuts were especially popular because they could be roasted easily over an open fire. As they roasted, their shells cracked open, releasing a warm, nutty smell that filled the cabin. Roasted chestnuts were both comforting and nourishing. For families living near forests rich with nut trees, these foods became important winter supplements. But perhaps one of the most interesting foods pioneers relied on during harsh winters was bone broth. Whenever animals were butchered, pioneers carefully saved the bones. Even after most of the meat had been eaten, the bones still contained valuable nutrients. These bones were placed into large pots of water and simmered slowly for hours, sometimes an entire day. As the bones cooked, minerals and collagen seeped into the water, creating a rich broth. This broth was not only warm and filling, but also nutritious. It helped strengthen the body during times when other nutrients might be scarce. Sometimes vegetables or bits of meat were added to the broth to create soup. Other times the broth itself was drunk from wooden cups, while people sat near the fire. It was simple, but it was effective. And during winter, effectiveness mattered far more than luxury. Another important frontier habit involved drying food before winter arrived. Drying food was one of the oldest preservation techniques in human history. Pioneers hung strips of meat, slices of fruit, and even vegetables in warm, dry places where air could circulate. Over time, the moisture evaporated, leaving behind food that could last for months. Dried apples were especially common. Apple trees were often planted by settlers because they were hardy and produced large harvests. During autumn, families sliced apples and laid them out to dry. The dried apples became chewy, Sweet pieces of fruit that could be stored all winter. Later, they could be added to stews, baked into pies, or simply eaten as snacks. For children growing up on the frontier, dried apples were sometimes the closest thing to candy during long winter months. Another preserved food that helped pioneers survive was smoked meat. Smoking meat was different from salting, though both methods aimed to preserve it. Meat was hung inside smokehouses, where fires burned slowly below. The smoke dried the meat and coated it with chemicals that slowed spoilage. This method produced meats with deep, smoky flavors. Smoked ham, smoked venison, and smoked fish were all common foods in pioneer communities. And because the smoking process removed moisture, these foods lasted far longer than fresh meat. But even with careful preparation, winter could still test the limits of pioneer food supplies. Blizzards could trap families inside their cabins for days. Sometimes hunting trips failed. Sometimes crops from the previous summer had not been strong enough. During those moments, pioneers relied not only on food, but also on patience. Meals became smaller. Ingredients were stretched. Stews were diluted with more water. Every scrap of food was used. Even the grease left in cooking pans was sometimes saved and reused for later meals. Nothing could be wasted. Yet even in those harsh conditions, pioneer families found moments of comfort around food. A pot simmering on the fire. The smell of bread baking in a Dutch oven. The warmth of roasted nuts shared with children near the hearth. These small moments mattered, because winter on the frontier was not just a battle against cold. It was a test of endurance, a test of planning, and a test of community. Families helped neighbors. Neighbors shared supplies. And together they relied on the foods that had carried generations of people through harsh winters long before them. Those foods might seem simple today, but they were powerful enough to keep entire communities alive in one of the most unforgiving environments early Americans ever faced. And as winter slowly crept towards its final weeks, the pioneers held on to one thought above all others. Spring would come eventually. The snow would melt. The rivers would flow again. And new food would grow from the land. But until that day arrived, they depended on every meal they had prepared, stored, and carefully saved. Because on the frontier, every bite counted. The breakfasts that powered a freezing day. For early American pioneers, winter mornings began long before the sun appeared. The cold was often strongest just before dawn. The fire that had burned through the night was usually nothing more than glowing coals. Frost sometimes coated the windows, and the wooden floors felt like blocks of ice beneath bare feet. Someone in the family would wake first. Usually it was the mother, or sometimes the father, if there was heavy work waiting outside. The first task was always the same: bring the fire back to life. Dry kindling was placed carefully over the coals. A few slow breaths or gentle blows of air would encourage the embers to glow brighter. Soon the kindling caught flame, and the hearth slowly returned to life. That fire meant warmth. But it also meant breakfast. And breakfast on the frontier was not a small meal. It had to prepare people for hours of hard labor in freezing conditions. Chopping wood, feeding animals, hauling water, repairing fences, and walking long distances through snow all required enormous energy. Without a strong breakfast, the body simply could not keep up. One of the most common pioneer breakfasts during winter was fried salt pork with bread. Salt pork had already been preserved months earlier during the autumn hog slaughter. Thick pieces of the salty meat were cut and placed into a hot iron skillet. As the meat cooked, fat slowly melted into the pan. That fat was incredibly valuable. Once enough fat had collected, slices of bread or pieces of cornmeal batter were placed directly into the skillet. They soaked up the grease and fried until crispy. The result was a meal packed with calories. The salt pork provided protein and fat. The bread or cornbread provided carbohydrates. Together, they created the kind of heavy meal that could fuel a long day of work in the cold. Another breakfast that appeared frequently in pioneer cabins was cornmeal mush. Cornmeal mush was simple but reliable. Cornmeal was slowly stirred into boiling water until it thickened into a dense porridge. Sometimes milk was added if the family had cows that were still producing during winter. When served hot, cornmeal mush warmed the body immediately. But pioneers often did something interesting with leftover mush. After the porridge cooled, it hardened into a solid block. The next morning, slices of that block could be cut and fried in a skillet with lard. This created crispy pieces of fried mush that were golden on the outside and soft inside. Children especially loved this version of the meal, and because it used leftovers, nothing was wasted. Another breakfast food that helped pioneers stay warm was oatmeal. While corn dominated many frontier farms, oats were also grown in certain regions. Oatmeal cooked slowly over the fire created a thick, filling dish that released energy slowly in the body. This slow release of energy helped people stay warm longer. Sometimes pioneers added small amounts of molasses or maple sugar to their oatmeal for sweetness. Even a small spoonful could transform a plain bowl of oats into something comforting on a freezing morning. And for children facing another cold day inside a drafty cabin, that sweetness made a big difference. Another important morning food was eggs. Even in winter, chickens often continued laying eggs, though not as frequently as in warmer seasons. Eggs were valuable because they were rich in protein and nutrients. Pioneers usually fried eggs in bacon grease or lard. This added even more calories to the meal. Sometimes eggs were scrambled together with leftover meat or potatoes, creating a simple but powerful breakfast dish. But perhaps one of the most beloved winter breakfasts on the frontier was biscuits with gravy. Biscuits were made from flour, baking powder, salt, and fat, often lard or butter if it was available. The dough was shaped into small rounds and baked in a Dutch oven placed among hot coals. The biscuits came out thick, fluffy, and golden. But the real magic came with the gravy. Gravy was made from the fat left behind after frying meat. Flour was stirred into the hot fat, forming a paste. Then milk or water was slowly added, while stirring until the mixture thickened into a rich sauce. Sometimes small pieces of sausage or pork were added. The result was a warm, creamy gravy poured generously over biscuits. It was heavy, it was rich, and it was exactly the kind of meal pioneers needed before stepping out into a freezing world. Another important part of the winter morning routine was hot drinks. Coffee had become extremely popular in America by the early 19th century. Many pioneers carried small supplies of coffee beans with them, even during long journeys. Beans were roasted in iron pans and ground by hand before brewing. The smell of fresh coffee filling a cabin early in the morning became a familiar and comforting part of frontier life. Coffee did more than wake people up. The warmth helped fight the cold, and the caffeine gave people a sense of energy and alertness before facing a long day. But coffee was not always available. When supplies ran low, pioneers turned to substitutes. Roasted corn, barley, or chicory roots were sometimes brewed into dark drinks that resembled coffee. While the taste was different, the warmth still provided comfort. Tea was also common among some pioneer families, especially those with European traditions. Herbal teas made from wild plants were sometimes used when imported tea leaves were unavailable. These drinks might include mint, sassafras, or other local herbs. Another surprising winter breakfast sometimes eaten on the frontier was apple butter with bread. Apple butter was made by cooking apples slowly for many hours until they turned into a thick, dark spread. Sugar and spices might be added if available. Once prepared, apple butter could be stored in sealed containers for months. During winter mornings, it was spread over bread or biscuits. It provided sweetness and small amounts of nutrients from the fruit. For families that had harvested large apple crops during autumn, apple butter became a treasured winter food. But even with all these meals, winter mornings on the frontier were rarely comfortable. The cold remained constant. The wind could whistle through cracks in the cabin walls, and sometimes breakfast was eaten quickly because chores could not wait. Animals needed feeding, water needed hauling, firewood needed cutting. Life on the frontier did not slow down simply because it was cold. Yet the meals eaten in those early hours helped pioneers face the challenges ahead. Each bite provided warmth, each cup of hot drink offered comfort, and each heavy breakfast gave the body the strength to endure another day of winter. Outside, the landscape might appear frozen and silent, but inside those small cabins, the fire burned, the skillets sizzled, and families gathered around simple meals that helped keep them alive. Those breakfasts were more than food. They were the fuel that powered the frontier through its coldest season. Rations, survival foods, and the secret calories of the frontier. As winter deepened across the frontier, pioneers faced months of cold, snow, and isolation. For families who remained in their cabins, careful planning and preservation of food had become essential. For travelers and settlers moving west, the stakes were even higher. The harsh reality was that without enough calories, the human body could not generate heat. And without heat, survival itself was at risk. One of the most crucial survival strategies for travelers on routes like the Oregon Trail or smaller migration paths involved preparing winter rations months in advance. These rations were carefully calculated to last days or even weeks without resupply. They were high in calories, compact, and designed to burn slowly inside the body to maintain warmth and energy. Salted meat, especially pork and beef, was a primary component. Pieces were heavily salted to prevent spoilage and packed in barrels or wooden boxes. Small strips could also be dried into jerky, a lightweight, nutrient-dense option that could be eaten on the go. Pemmican remained a favorite among explorers and hunters. Its combination of dried meat, rendered fat, and occasionally berries made it one of the most efficient foods ever created for survival. Travelers could carry enough pemmican to sustain themselves for days, even in blizzards or when hunting failed. Another critical item for winter travel was hardtack. This dense, dry biscuit could survive months in a pack without spoiling. It was often softened in coffee, water, or broth to make it edible. While bland, hardtack provided vital carbohydrates, quick fuel for energy-hungry bodies. But rations alone were not enough. Pioneers needed additional calories to stay warm, and they relied on fat in every form. Lard, tallow, and rendered animal fats were added to stews, breads, and beans. The body metabolized fat slowly, providing long-lasting energy that helped maintain core temperature. In addition to these staples, travelers sometimes included small amounts of sugar or molasses in their packs. These provided a quick energy boost and a sense of comfort during arduous treks. Even a spoonful of sugar could make a noticeable difference in stamina and morale. Frontier desserts, surprisingly, were also functional survival foods. Fruit preserves, apple butter, and dried berries were all high in calories and could be eaten alone or added to breads and porridges. Sweetness in winter meals helped balance the heavy, salty, and fatty foods. But more importantly, it delivered energy quickly to help generate warmth. During particularly severe winters or long journeys, pioneers occasionally relied on unconventional foods to survive. This included tree bark, particularly the inner bark of pines and maples, which could be dried and ground into flour in emergencies. Although not palatable, this flour added fiber and bulk to meals. Similarly, wild nuts, hickory, walnuts, chestnuts, became vital. Roasted over fire or boiled, they provided dense calories, fats, and proteins. For travelers unable to hunt or obtain fresh meat, nuts were life-saving. Another source of warmth and nutrition came from bone marrow. Bones from preserved or hunted animals could be cracked open to extract marrow, which is extremely calorie-dense. It could be eaten raw, cooked into stews, or rendered into fat. Even the practice of drinking hot broths was a carefully learned survival technique. Hot liquids not only provided hydration, but also temporarily raised body temperature and improved circulation. Broths made from meat, bones, or even dried vegetables were highly valued. Children on the frontier had unique challenges. Their smaller bodies burned energy quickly, and the cold could be deadly. Mothers often prepared thicker porridges, sweetened with molasses or maple sugar, and added bits of fat or dried meat to boost calories. Roasted nuts and small pieces of jerky were often given as snacks between meals, keeping energy levels consistent throughout the day. For mountain men and trappers, survival in winter wilderness was even more extreme. Their diets consisted almost entirely of high-calorie, preserved foods: pemmican, dried meat, fat, nuts, and sometimes smoked fish. Hunting provided fresh meat when possible, but for weeks at a time, trappers survived almost entirely on rations they carried in their packs. One fascinating survival strategy involved combining foods to maximize caloric density. Pioneers often layered ingredients: cornbread fried in lard with molasses on top, salted meat mixed into bean stews, or porridge enriched with melted fat and dried fruit. Each combination increased energy output and helped generate body heat in extreme conditions. Even in extreme cold, small daily routines, like starting the fire early, boiling water, and preparing hot meals, were essential to survival. Every effort ensured that the body received sufficient fuel to endure long hours outside in snow, wind, and frost. Ultimately, the winter diet of early American pioneers was defined by function over taste. While these meals might seem unappetizing today, their design was simple: high-calorie, warming, and sustainable. Corn, beans, salted meat, fat, nuts, preserved fruits, and hot liquids created the energy needed to survive harsh winters and travel across frozen landscapes. The ingenuity of these early Americans was not just in growing and storing food, but in knowing how to use it to maintain warmth, strength, and life itself during the deadliest months of the year. Starvation foods, regional variations, and the art of stretching supplies. Even the most prepared pioneer families sometimes faced winters harsher than they had expected. Snowstorms could trap cabins for weeks. Hunting might fail. Stored food could spoil or run low. During these moments, survival required ingenuity, resourcefulness, and sometimes foods that would seem strange to modern eyes. One of the most extreme survival foods was tree bark. Specifically, the inner bark of pine, maple, or elm trees could be scraped, dried, and ground into a coarse flour. This flour could be added to porridge, bread, or dumplings. While not flavorful, it provided fiber and minimal calories. And in desperate times, it could literally keep a family alive. Another emergency food included roots and bulbs. Pioneers often dug wild onions, dandelion roots, or cattail roots from frozen ground. These were boiled to extract calories and nutrients. Some roots were roasted or mashed, making them easier to digest. The taste might be bitter, but the warmth and energy they provided were invaluable. Pioneers also relied on foraged nuts and seeds. Even in midwinter, some nuts could be gathered from fallen branches or collected during autumn and stored. Acorns were often leached to remove tannins, then ground into flour for bread or porridge. Sunflower seeds, pumpkin seeds, and hickory nuts were eaten raw or roasted over the fire. These foods provided fats and protein, which were essential for maintaining body heat. For meat, when hunting failed, pioneers occasionally consumed small game, such as squirrels, rabbits, muskrats, or birds. While not every child or adult enjoyed these meals, their fat and protein were necessary. Mountain men and trappers often supplemented this with fish, especially in frozen rivers, where ice fishing provided a reliable source of food. Some families had to resort to dried or salted insects. Though rare, historical records indicate that in extreme starvation situations, pioneers used grubs, locusts, or other insects for protein. This was a last resort, but demonstrates the extreme adaptability required to survive severe frontier winters. Families became experts at stretching supplies. A small piece of salt pork might be chopped into many meals. Beans were simmered into thick soups that could feed several days. Leftover cornbread or dumplings were reused and cooked into new dishes. Even the grease left in a skillet was saved for later meals. Nothing could be wasted. Regional variations also influenced winter diets. In the Midwest, settlers relied heavily on corn, beans, pork, and preserved meats. Cornbread, mush, and hearty stews were staples. In the Northeast, where dairy farming was more common, milk, cheese, and butter were frequently included, and cabbage and root vegetables like turnips and carrots provided nutrition. In the South, preserved pork and cornmeal were still essential, but families also incorporated wild greens and winter squash. Sweet potatoes were a critical source of calories in southern winters, offering carbohydrates and nutrients not found in preserved grains. Children's diets were carefully monitored. Parents knew that smaller bodies burned calories faster, especially in cold weather. Children received more frequent small meals, often enriched with fats and sugars to maintain warmth. Dried fruits, roasted nuts, and small portions of meat or porridge were common. Even simple foods like fried mush or cornbread with molasses became life-saving staples. Elderly members of families had special needs as well. Their slower metabolism and frailer bodies made staying warm more difficult. Soups and broths enriched with fat, soft breads, and stews provided the nutrition and calories necessary to survive. Families often ensured that elders received the most calorically dense portions first, understanding that warmth and energy were literally life-saving. Another important frontier survival strategy was communal sharing. In small settlements, neighbors often shared food when one family ran low. Bartering occurred for stored supplies. Those who hunted successfully sometimes distributed portions to those unable to travel in deep snow. Community networks were critical for survival in winters when isolation could be deadly. Despite the harshness, winter also brought small joys related to food. Families celebrated the first snowfall with warm porridge or special breads. Leftovers from preserved fruits and baked goods provided comfort. Hot drinks, whether coffee, tea, or herbal infusions, were cherished morning and night. These rituals not only nourished the body, but also sustained morale. Pioneers developed deep knowledge about how to combine foods for maximum warmth. Carbohydrates provide immediate energy. Fat burned slowly, maintaining heat for hours. Protein helped repair muscles and sustain strength. By mixing beans, cornmeal, meat, and fat in soups and stews, they created meals perfectly suited to endure freezing days. Ultimately, survival in the deadliest winter months was not just about what pioneers ate, but how they planned, stored, and prepared food. Every calorie mattered. Every meal was a battle against hunger and cold. And every family learned, through experience and necessity, which foods would keep them warm and alive until spring. Rituals, sweets, and survival in the coldest months. As winter deepened on the frontier, food became more than sustenance. It became ritual, comfort, and a measure of hope. Early American pioneers learned that meals could sustain the body, lift the spirit, and help families endure even the most brutal weather. Even in small cabins with few luxuries, certain routines developed around eating. Breakfast, the most important meal, was prepared carefully. Cornmeal mush, fried pork, and hot breads were served early to fuel the day's labor. Families often gathered together, sharing hot drinks and ensuring everyone received enough calories to maintain warmth. In some households, children were allowed to eat first, giving them energy before long hours outside. Dinner, often called the main meal, was a time to combine whatever had been stored or foraged. Stews thick with beans, meat, and root vegetables simmered for hours over the hearth. Dumplings or small breads were added for bulk. Leftover meats were incorporated into soups, and even the smallest scraps of fat were preserved for future meals. This careful, repeated use of ingredients was essential for survival. Desserts, surprisingly, were more than just indulgence. Apple butter, dried fruits, molasses cakes, and sweetened cornbread were not only comforting, but also provided concentrated energy. A small spoonful of sugar or molasses could help a worker stave off exhaustion during a day of chopping wood, hauling water, or repairing fences in freezing conditions. Pioneers learned to balance heavy meals with sweet treats, ensuring that energy burned during labor and cold exposure was replenished. For travelers and settlers moving west, winter meals became strategic tools for survival. Those on long routes, such as the Oregon Trail, often relied on compact, high-calorie foods: pemmican, dried meat, hardtack, nuts, and molasses. Every ounce mattered. Families rationed carefully, eating small portions frequently, combining ingredients to create warm, filling meals that could last through blizzards and freezing nights. Extreme situations sometimes required improvisation. Some pioneers boiled tree bark into porridge, ground acorns into flour, or even roasted insects for protein. Wild plants, roots, and foraged nuts became crucial, when stored supplies dwindled. These practices, while unappealing by modern standards, often determined who survived long, harsh winters. Pioneer communities also developed sharing rituals. When one family hunted successfully, a portion was distributed to neighbors. Families often bartered or exchanged preserves, dried fruits, and stored meats. Meals became a communal survival strategy as much as a necessity, reinforcing bonds and creating networks of support in a landscape that could be deadly. Even daily routines around food provided warmth. Lighting the hearth early, boiling water for porridge, roasting nuts, or simmering stews produced heat that filled the cabin. The act of preparing food was also a mental comfort. Watching bread rise, meat sizzle, or beans soften in a pot reminded families that, despite the frozen world outside, life could continue indoors. Children learned survival from these routines. They observed how adults preserved fat, stored cornmeal, and stretched small portions. They learned which plants were safe to eat, how to roast nuts, and how to combine ingredients to maximize warmth and energy. These lessons were passed from generation to generation, creating a body of frontier knowledge that was crucial for enduring winter. For elders, meals were tailored to provide warmth and nourishment without requiring strenuous preparation. Soft breads, thick porridges, stews, and broths provided calories and hydration while being easy to consume. Families recognized the importance of sustaining all members, especially those most vulnerable to cold and hunger. In many ways, pioneer winter meals were an early form of applied nutrition science. The combination of carbohydrates, fat, protein, and small amounts of sugar created a diet that sustained the body against extreme cold. Repetition and careful planning ensured energy was available for physical labor and heat generation. Small celebrations occurred when food supplies held. Families marked holidays or significant events with special meals. A rich stew, a baked sweet, or extra portions of meat. Even minor successes, like catching a rabbit or harvesting enough nuts, were reasons to gather, share food, and restore morale. Winter on the frontier was harsh, unforgiving, and often deadly. But food, carefully prepared, stored, shared, and consumed, was a powerful tool against the cold. It nourished the body, strengthened the spirit, and connected families and communities in a common struggle for survival. As the days slowly lengthened and snow began to melt, pioneers looked forward not just to spring planting, but also to a return of abundance. Yet, until that thaw, every meal remained a lifeline. Every pot of stew, every slice of cornbread, and every sip of hot broth was part of a strategy to endure, to stay warm, and to survive the deadliest months of the year. Last resort foods and extreme winter survival. Even the best prepared pioneers sometimes faced winters that pushed survival skills to their limits. Heavy snowstorms could block travel, ruin food stores, and leave families isolated for weeks. In these moments, ingenuity, and sometimes desperation, determined life or death. When normal supplies ran low, pioneers turned to last resort foods. One of the most common was tree bark, especially the soft inner layer of pine, elm, or maple. Scraped and dried, this bark could be ground into flour to mix with cornmeal or cooked into a coarse porridge. It was not tasty, but it provided fiber and a small amount of energy to stave off starvation. Roots and wild bulbs were also critical emergency foods. Dandelion roots, cattail roots, and wild onions were dug from the frozen ground, often requiring hours of work in sub-zero temperatures. Once boiled or roasted, These roots provided calories, vitamins, and essential nutrients, though the taste was bitter and plain. In times of extreme scarcity, pioneers sometimes relied on insects and small animals. Grubs, locusts, or even grasshoppers were occasionally eaten for protein. Rabbits, squirrels, and muskrats became vital sources of meat when larger game had disappeared. Fish caught through ice holes were another life-saving option for families living near rivers or lakes. Another emergency strategy was mixing foods to maximize calories. Pioneers would add rendered fat to porridge, crush nuts into bread dough, or simmer bones into broths with a few remaining vegetables. These combinations increased the caloric content of meager supplies, helping maintain body warmth in extreme conditions. Families carefully rationed high-calorie foods for maximum effect. Fatty meats, pemmican, and hardtack were divided into small daily portions, ensuring that each family member received enough energy to survive. Molasses or maple sugar was added sparingly to provide quick bursts of energy for labor-intensive days. Every calorie mattered because each burned calorie helped maintain internal body heat against freezing temperatures. On the move, pioneers traveling routes like the Oregon Trail relied on compact rations that could last for days without spoiling. Dried beans, cornmeal, salted meats, and hardtack were staples. Travelers often carried pemmican and dried fruits as emergency energy sources. Small portions were eaten frequently to maintain constant energy output. Children required special consideration. Smaller bodies burned calories more quickly, and hypothermia could set in rapidly. Parents often fed children porridge or mush enriched with fat, small amounts of dried meat, or molasses. Warm beverages, such as coffee, tea, or herbal infusions, helped maintain core temperature while providing comfort. Elderly family members were similarly prioritized. Soft, calorically dense foods, soups, broths, stews, and baked goods enriched with fat, ensured that older pioneers received energy without exertion. Maintaining warmth and strength for all members of the family was essential, as survival often depended on cooperation and mutual support. Even in extreme winter conditions, pioneers found ways to boost morale through food rituals. Special meals, however small, were prepared to celebrate milestones, weathering storms, or minor successes in hunting or gathering. Apple butter, molasses cakes, or a small portion of roasted nuts could lift spirits and remind families that survival was possible. Frontier ingenuity also included strategic use of hot foods. Broths, soups, and porridge were often reheated multiple times throughout the day to provide warmth. Hot drinks and stews also helped fight frostbite and hypothermia, particularly when labor required long exposure to the cold. Finally, pioneers learned that survival was not only about eating, but about preparation and planning. Autumn harvests had to be preserved carefully, fat, meat, and grains stored safely, roots and nuts collected and dried, and knowledge of edible wild plants passed down through generations. Families who mastered these skills were far more likely to endure the deadliest winters. Winter on the frontier was brutal. Cold, snow, isolation, and scarcity tested pioneers relentlessly. Yet through careful rationing, ingenious preparation, and strategic use of high-calorie foods, early Americans survived. They turned simple, preserved, and even unconventional ingredients into meals that sustained body heat, strength, and hope. Food was not just nourishment, it was survival, comfort, and community. And in the long, frozen months, every meal became a lifeline, from winter survival to spring renewal. After months of freezing temperatures, snow-covered landscapes, and long nights spent near the hearth, the first signs of spring brought relief and a chance to reflect on survival. For early American pioneers, winter was the ultimate test. How they ate, preserved, and shared food determined whether families survived until the thaw. As snow began to melt and days grew longer, pioneers celebrated the small victories of survival. Every cabin that had made it through the worst months was a testament to preparation, ingenuity, and endurance. Food played a central role in these celebrations. Special dishes, often reserved for rare occasions, were prepared to mark the end of winter. Spring meals often included the first fresh vegetables, like onions, leeks, or wild greens, which added nutrients and color to diets that had been dominated by preserved foods. Families boiled early greens into soups, added them to stews, or baked them into breads. These fresh ingredients were a welcome change from the heavy, calorie-dense foods of winter. Pioneer families also celebrated with baked goods and preserved treats that had been saved from autumn. Fruit preserves, apple butter, and molasses cakes provided sweetness that lifted spirits after months of simple, functional meals. Even small quantities were cherished and often shared among neighbors. Spring was also a time to replenish food stores for the coming year. Families planted crops, gathered early seeds, and checked caches of dried fruits, nuts, and grains. Livestock, which had been fed primarily stored fodder during winter, were released to graze on the new grass. Hunting and fishing resumed in earnest, providing fresh meat to supplement stored provisions. The lessons learned during winter were carefully observed and passed down to children. Young pioneers remembered which foods provided the most warmth, which combinations sustained energy, and which assured supplies lasted for months. This knowledge became part of the family legacy, a guide for surviving future winters. Even small rituals and routines developed around food reinforced survival skills. Families continued to prepare stews, soups, and broths, teaching children how to combine ingredients for maximum nutrition. Hot drinks, once a lifeline during freezing mornings, became a comforting spring habit. Cooking over the hearth remained central to daily life, reinforcing both warmth and family cohesion. For travelers and pioneers on the move, spring marked a shift from strict rationing to more varied meals. Fresh vegetables, newly caught fish, and early game replaced some preserved foods, while high-calorie staples like pemmican and hardtack remained for long journeys. The transition also offered a reprieve from the monotony of winter rations and a chance to regain strength after months of demanding survival diets. Winter survival also taught pioneers the value of community and cooperation. Families that shared food, traded preserves, and assisted neighbors during blizzards often fared better. Spring provided an opportunity to strengthen these bonds, sharing seeds, livestock, and knowledge to ensure all families were prepared for the next harsh season. Ultimately, the winter diet of early American pioneers, heavy stews, breads, dumplings, preserved meats, nuts, and emergency foods, was more than sustenance. It was a calculated strategy for survival, blending calories, warmth, and nutrients to endure extreme conditions. It was also a source of comfort, ritual, and community. As the ice melted and the first shoots of spring appeared, pioneers knew they had survived, not just because of strength or courage, but because they had mastered the art of food. What to store, how to prepare it, and how to use it to endure the deadliest months of the year. Winter passed, but the lessons stayed. These lessons shaped generations of settlers, teaching that survival was as much about wisdom in eating and sharing as it was about hard work in the wilderness. And so, from the hearths of frozen cabins to the thawing fields of spring, food remained the silent hero of the frontier, warming bodies, sustaining life, and nurturing hope for the seasons yet to come. Stories, recipes, and the legacy of winter survival. Even after the thaw of spring, the memory of winter lingered in pioneer households. Food had been more than sustenance. It had been survival, comfort, and community. In this bonus section, we explore stories, recipes, and the legacy of what early Americans ate to endure the deadliest months. One remarkable story comes from families living along the Ohio River during a particularly harsh winter in the early 1800s. Snowdrifts sometimes reached the tops of fences, and hunters struggled to find game. One family survived for weeks, almost entirely on dried beans, salted pork, and cornmeal mush. They supplemented their meals by roasting hickory nuts and melting small amounts of lard into their porridge. The children recalled that even a spoonful of molasses felt like a luxury, bringing warmth and sweetness in the cold cabin. In New England, settlers faced frozen fields and deep snow. One diary recounts that families made perpetual stew, a simmering pot that lasted for days, replenished with whatever meat, roots, or vegetables were available. This method not only stretched limited resources, but also kept the cabin warm through constant cooking over the fire. The smell of stew became a symbol of endurance and hope. Recipes, though simple, were practical. Pioneer stew combined salted meat, beans, potatoes, onions, and sometimes cornmeal dumplings. Cooked slowly over the fire, it provided protein, carbohydrates, and fat in one nourishing dish. Fried mush, made from leftover cornmeal porridge, offered another warm, filling option for children and laborers. Pemmican, with its mix of dried meat, fat, and berries, remained the ultimate high-calorie, portable food for travelers and trappers. Breakfast routines were especially important. Families relied on fried pork with cornbread, oatmeal enriched with fat and molasses, and eggs cooked in leftover grease. Hot coffee, tea, or herbal infusions helped the body maintain warmth and boosted morale during frigid mornings. Even small portions were carefully rationed to ensure everyone had enough energy to endure the day. Dessert served both a nutritional and emotional purpose. Apple butter, molasses cakes, and preserved fruits added calories and sugar to boost energy, while providing comfort after long hours of work in the cold. Sweetened cornbread, or fried mush, was sometimes the highlight of the day for children, offering both warmth and a sense of indulgence in an otherwise utilitarian diet. Emergency survival foods were sometimes extreme. Tree bark, roots, and small animals like squirrels or muskrats were consumed when traditional supplies ran out. Nuts, seeds, and even roasted insects occasionally supplemented protein intake. While unappetizing by modern standards, these foods exemplified the ingenuity and adaptability of pioneers facing the harshest winters. Winter survival also shaped community bonds. Families shared surplus foods, traded preserves, and helped neighbors who were isolated or running low on supplies. Communal meals, even small ones, became lifelines, reinforcing cooperation and trust. These traditions of sharing ensured that more families made it through the deadliest months. Finally, the legacy of pioneer winter survival extends beyond mere sustenance. Knowledge of preserving food, combining ingredients for maximum warmth, and rationing calories shaped later generations. These practices influenced American cooking, from hearty stews and dumplings to breads enriched with fat and sweetness. Even today, many traditional recipes trace their roots to the ingenuity of early settlers who endured freezing winters with limited resources. Through stories, recipes, and shared experiences, it is clear that food was the foundation of survival on the frontier. Every meal provided warmth, energy, and hope. The skills, rituals, and knowledge passed down during these harsh winters ensured that generations of Americans could thrive, even in the face of extreme cold. Winter on the frontier was more than a season. It was a test, and those who survived did so through preparation, ingenuity, and the transformative power of food, the enduring lessons of winter survival. Winter on the American frontier was a test like no other. It demanded endurance, foresight, and ingenuity. From the first snowfall to the thaw of spring, early pioneers relied on every skill they had learned: how to store, preserve, and prepare food, how to combine ingredients to maximize warmth and energy, and how to share with family and neighbors to ensure collective survival. The foods they relied upon were simple, yet powerful. Salted and smoked meats, pemmican, hardtack, cornbread, stews, porridges, and broths formed the backbone of their winter diet. Fats, nuts, and preserved fruits added essential calories, while roots, wild greens, and emergency foods sustained them when conventional supplies failed. Every ingredient was used with purpose, nothing wasted. Beyond nutrition, food offered comfort: the warmth of a simmering stew, the aroma of baking bread, the sweetness of molasses or apple butter. These small pleasures carried families through long nights and freezing days. Food was not just survival, it was a symbol of hope, family unity, and resilience in the face of relentless cold. Children learned essential lessons at the hearth, observing how meals were prepared, how ingredients were rationed, and how to endure. Elders guided the process, ensuring that everyone had enough energy to work, play, and survive. Travelers, hunters, and mountain men applied these same principles on the road, carrying portable, high-calorie foods and relying on their knowledge of the land. Winter survival also taught the pioneers the importance of community. Sharing resources, assisting neighbors, and passing down knowledge ensured that entire settlements could endure even the harshest months. Meals became a communal bond, a ritual that reinforced cooperation and mutual support. With the arrival of spring, pioneers celebrated survival. Fresh greens, newly caught game, and early crops replaced stored provisions. Yet the lessons of winter were never forgotten. Careful preparation, strategic use of calories, preservation, and adaptability. These skills were not just temporary solutions. They became a legacy, influencing American cooking, frontier culture, and family traditions for generations. Ultimately, the story of what early American pioneers ate to stay warm during deadly winters is a story of resilience, ingenuity, and the human spirit. It is a reminder that survival is as much about knowledge, planning, and cooperation as it is about courage. Food on the frontier was more than fuel. It was life itself. Through months of snow, frost, and isolation, pioneers endured. They warmed themselves with fire and food, sustained themselves with ingenuity, and passed down the wisdom that ensured future generations could survive the coldest winters. And in that endurance, we see the timeless power of preparation, adaptation, and community, the true legacy of the frontier.